Good day, everyone. Hi, everyone. BSEd Social Studies 1-2. We are the reporters of Group 4 in Readings and Philippine History. Now, before anything else, let us begin with a short activity to freshen things up. Since this is an online recorded format, you will be participating by observing and thinking as activity is presented. I will show you a set of words with images with missing letters. Your task here is to guess the complete word based on what image is shown. Okay? Is that clear? Okay, let's go. Now, here it is. Take a moment to observe each one carefully and try to complete the word. Are you done guessing? Okay. Now, let me show you the correct answers. Ta-da! Here we have protest, violence, and headlines. Now, maybe mag-wonder mo why these words are presented. Now, these words are all connected to situations involving tension, conflict, and major events happening in a country. These ideas will help us understand the topic that we are about to discuss. But before we move forward, let us first look at our learning objectives. Now, here are our learning objectives. By the end of this presentation, learners are expected to describe the background conditions in the Philippines before martial law, including political, economic, and social factors. Explain the reasons given by the government under Ferdinand Marcos for declaring martial law. Analyze key events used to justify these declarations. Differentiate the government's justification and critics' perspective. Interpret the legal basis, particularly Proclamation number 1081. And lastly, develop a clear grasp of the topic by examining and assessing key concepts and perspectives. Now, I hope that we can achieve these learning objectives by you actively listen to our lesson or presentation and by you allowing yourself to understand this lesson. Okay. Now, let us begin. Today, we will be discussing why martial law was declared in the Philippines. One of the most important and also one of the most controversial moments in our history, especially in the presidential lead of Ferdinand Marcos. Now, martial law was declared on September 21, 1972, and it is announced to the public on September 23 of the same year. This is a decision that changed the direction of our country. At that time, the government explained that this was a necessary step. They pointed to rising insurgency, increasing violence, and growing unrest across the nation. According to them, martial law was meant to restore order and protect the country from further instability. However, many critics saw it differently. They believed that martial law was used to expand presidential power. They believed that it is used to go beyond normal limits of leadership and silence those who opposed the government. Because of these different views, the question of why martial law was declared in our country does not have a single answer. Now, in this presentation, we will explore both sides to better understand the reasons behind this decision and its impact on our country.
Good day everyone. So I will discuss the situation before martial law, political, economic, and social conditions. First, let's discuss the political climate. Before martial law, the country was experiencing a tense political situation under Ferdinand Marcos. There was a growing opposition from different groups including the politicians, journalists, and ordinary citizens who criticized the government. But at the same time, student activism increased, especially during events like the protests and rallies. Many students were speaking out against corruption, abuse of power, and lack of reforms. Because of this, public trust in the government began to decline as more people felt that the leadership was no longer serving the nation properly. So this political unrest showed that many Filipinos were dissatisfied with the government, which created tension and instability. Second is the economic conditions. The country also faced serious economic problems. There was a high inflation, meaning prices of goods and services kept increasing, making life harder for ordinary people. There was also unemployment and inequality, where many people struggled to find jobs while only a few benefited from economic growth. This caused frustration among the youth and the middle class, who felt that their future was uncertain. The economic hardship made people more likely to protest and demand change, increasing dissatisfaction with the government. And lastly, the third, the social unrest. Because of political and economic issues, social unrest became common. There were frequent demonstrations, strikes, and rallies in different parts of the country. However, many of these protests were met with violent dispersals and clashes between protesters and authorities. This led to injuries, arrests, and even deaths in some cases. So the constant conflict between citizens and the government created fear and instability in society.
Government justification martial law pro-Marcos perspective. So sa part na to, i-explain natin kung ano yung naging reason ng government, especially during Marcos time, kung bakit nila dineclare ang martial law noong 1972. Importante lang din no, na klaro tayo dito. This is the government side or justification, meaning kung paano nila dinefend or paano nila inexplain yung decision na yon, not necessarily kung agree ba tayo or hindi. Isa sa pinaka-main reason na sinabi ng government is yung pagdami daw ng communist movement sa Pilipinas. Around 1960s to early 1970s, na-reestablish yung Communist Party of the Philippines. Tapos nabuo yung armed wing nila na New People's Army or yung NPA na tinatawag natin. Ang claim ng government is hindi lang daw ito simple political group kundi armado na siya at lumalawak sa mga probinsya, especially sa rural areas. May mga reports din sila na may recruitment sa students, mga farmers, mga workers. So, ang narrative ng government doon, hindi na ito simple na activism, kundi it is an early stage ng armed rebellion. Meaning, sa perspective nila, kailangan na talaga ng strong action before lumala. Another reason na nilabas ng government is yung lumalalang protest at unrest sa cities, especially in Manila. During that time, sobrang active ng student movements and labor strikes and rallies. May mga pagkakataon na nauuwi siya sa clash between Protestants and police. Isa sa pinaka-famous dito is yung First Quarter Storm. Ito yung series of massive protest na mostly led by students. Sa government side naman, ang interpretation nila dito is hindi na raw siya peaceful protest, nagiging violent na, nagdudulot na siya ng chaos sa public order. So yung message nila, parang nawawala na yung control ng government sa streets. Dito na pumasok yung mga specific incidents na ginagamit talaga ng government justification. First is yung Plaza Miranda bombing. Nangyari ito during political rally ng opposition party. Maraming injured, including politicians, no? Then, next is yung alleged ambush ni Defense Secretary Juan Ponce Enrile. Yung government narrative dito, Sa point of view ng government, pinakita nila na pati daw politicians and government officials hindi na raw safe. Lumalabas na may organized violence targeting the state. So, sa perspective nila, hindi na siya ordinary unrest, parang escalating political violence na talaga.
Now that we've heard the government's justification for martial law, let's now look at the other side, the critic's perspective, which presents a different interpretation of the same event. From the critic's perspective, martial law under Ferdinand Marcos was not only about protecting the country, but also a way to consolidate power. First, many believed there was an abuse of power. When martial law was declared through Proclamation number 1081, most of the government's power became concentrated in Marcos. Congress was dissolved, and he was able to rule by decree. This weakened the system of checks and balances and limited democratic processes. Second, critics argue that martial law allowed Marcos to extend his rule beyond constitutional limits. At that time, presidents were only allowed a limited number of terms, but because of martial law, he remained in power much longer. For many, this shows that the declaration was not only about national security, but also a political strategy. Another issue was the suppression of opposition. Many critics, journalists, and student leaders were arrested without warrants. For example, Benigno Aquino Jr., a well-known critic of Marcos, was imprisoned for several years. Media outlets were also shut down, and those that remained were controlled by the government, limiting freedom of speech and press. Critics also questioned the threats used to justify martial law. The alleged ambush of Juan Ponce Enrile later became controversial, with some claiming it may not have been genuine. Because of this, many believe that fear was used to justify the declaration. There were serious human rights violations. According to historical records, thousands of people were arrested and many reported abuse while in detention. These effects were not limited to politicians. Ordinary citizens were also affected. Many people become afraid to speak out as even simple criticisms could lead to arrest. The impact of martial law is also shown in films like Dekada 70, which portrays how an ordinary Filipino family was affected, especially the youth. This shows that martial law was not just about a political issue, but also a personal and social experience for many Filipinos. In conclusion, from the critic's point of view, martial law was not only about restoring order, it was also a time when freedoms were limited, fear spread among citizens, and power became concentrated in one leader. This reminds us that even when a government claims to protect the nation, it is important to question whether people's right and democracy are still being upheld.
Now let's talk about the legal basis. To address these problems, former President Marcos declared the martial law through Proclamation number 1081. This was based on the constitutional provision that allows the president to declare martial law in cases of rebellion or invasion in order to maintain the peace and order. So the government claimed that there was a serious threat to national security which justified the declaration. The question is, was the situation severe enough? Despite the reasons given, many people question whether the situation was truly severe enough to declare martial law. Some believe that the unrest and threats were real and needed strong action. However, others argue that the situation was exaggerated or used as a reason to extend power and control. So this debate is important because it helps us think critically about history and understand different perspectives.
In 1972, the Philippines entered a period known as a martial law, a time that significantly changed the country's political and social landscape. So we will explore this important period by looking at the two different perspectives: the government view pro-Marcos and the critics view anti-Marcos. So the question here is, did martial law save the country or did it control it? Now, let's begin by understanding the two sides. On the government side, led by Ferdinand Marcos, martial law was seen as a necessary step to maintain security and order. At that time, the government believed that there was a serious threat from the Communist Party of the Philippines and its armed group, the New People's Army. There were also many protests and demonstrations, especially during the first quarter's term, which sometimes turned violent. In addition, incidents like Plaza Miranda bombing increased fear and tension. Because of these events, the government declared Proclamation Number 1081 to restore peace, stop violence, and protect the nation. On the other hand, critics believe that martial law was not only about security, but also about controlling power. They argue that it allowed Marcos to concentrate authority in himself, dissolve Congress, and stay in power longer than the Constitution allowed. Many critics, journalists, and activists were arrested, and media outlets were shut down. There were also reports of human rights violations, such as arrests without warrants and loss of freedom of speech and press. Some critics also questioned whether the threats were exaggerated to justify declaring martial law. The main difference between the two sides can be seen in security versus freedom, and order versus democracy. The government focused on protecting the country and maintaining stability, while critics focus on protecting people's rights and democratic institutions. So, martial law can be viewed in two ways: as a way to protect the nation from chaos, or as a way to limit freedom and democracy. The answer depends on perspective, but both sides show its strong impact of the country and its people.
Now, to summarize everything that has been discussed, let us go over the key concepts of martial law in the Philippines. The period of martial law in the Philippines declared by Ferdinand Marcos through Proclamation 1081 was legally based on constitution, which allowed such action during times of rebellion or national threat. On the other hand, the government justified martial law by pointing to the growing communist insurgency led by Communist Party of the Philippines and the New People's Army, as well as the widespread of social unrest and violent events like the First Quarter Storm and the Plaza Miranda bombing. The reported ambush of Juan Ponce Enrile was also used to support the claim that our country was in danger. On the other hand, critics argue that martial law became a tool for abuse of power. It led to the concentration of authority, suppression of opposition, and numerous human rights violations, ultimately resulting in an authoritarian form of governance. In the end, martial law in the Philippines is not just a chapter in history. It is a powerful reminder of how a nation can be shaped by both fear and authority. Under Ferdinand Marcos, what was presented a solution to disorder became hardships for many, a period marked by silence, control, and lost freedoms. It teaches us that while governments may act in the name of security, the true strength of a nation lies in protecting the rights, voices, and dignity of its people. History challenges us not only to remember what happened, but to question, to reflect, and to ensure that such a moment is never repeated. Because in understanding martial law, we are not just looking at the past, we are safeguarding the future. Once again, we are the Group 4, and thank you very much.